Okay. Still trying to get the hang of this. It says I'm live, and hopefully it's picking up audio. Okay. I'm going to be reading more from the synaptic self, how our brains become who we are. I think I'm going to start this video with Chapter 2, Seeking the Self. Before we go looking for the essence of a person in the brain, it would help to have some conception of what we are seeking. There's certainly no shortage of opinion about what terms like personality or the self might mean. William James, for example, proposed, in its widest possible sense, a man's self is the sum total of all that he can call his, not only his body and his psychic powers, but his clothes and his wife, his house and his children, his ancestors and friends, his reputation and works, his lands and horses and yacht and bank account. If they wax and prosper, he feels triumphant. If they dwindle and die away, he feels cast down, not necessarily in the same degree for each thing, but in much the same way for all. In fact, a whole area of psychology is devoted to the study of personality and the self. And theologians, philosophers, novelists, and poets have also had much to say on the subject. While seemingly deep truths have sometimes emerged from these musings, it is not clear how, if at all, these insights might relate to the workings of the brain. After all, for many people, the brain and the self are quite different. I hope to show here that this is not the case. To do so, I first need to describe a way of thinking about the self that is compatible with current understanding of brain function. Hello, OVR. Thank you for thanks for the note that the audio is working. Soul Serenade. A few months after starting this book, I attended a conference on the relation between the brain and the soul, sponsored by, fittingly enough, the Vatican. The specific topic was neuroscience and divine action, and the theologians who organized this meeting were trying to reconceptualize church teachings in a way that would make sense in light of current scientific understanding of how the world works. In particular, they were attempting to determine how it is possible for God to influence people's lives without violating the laws of physics. I can't present the full range of views expressed, but one that stood out was the notion that God interacts but doesn't intervene. The basic idea goes something like this. In the beginning, God set the universe up in a certain way, that is, created the laws of physics, and has subsequently left it alone, at least for the most part. On a typical day, therefore, God doesn't control the positions of stars and planets, move mountains, part seas, change weather conditions, or make people do things they wouldn't otherwise do. In other words, he doesn't usually intervene. But God does communicate with people. He interacts. Our concern here is not with the theological arguments for and against a non-interventionist view of God, but rather with the possibility or impossibility of a scientific view of interaction. Given that people live a physical existence in the physical world, and that God is not part of the physical world, the question is, how can God interact with people? If you believe in the existence of a non-material soul, then all you need to assume is that when God was creating the universe, God worked out some way of interacting with the soul. Since both God and the soul are non-material, that interaction would also be non-material, and the laws of physics would therefore be unviolated when interactions occur. Much to my surprise, however, many of the theologians attending this meeting didn't believe in a classic non-material soul. This would probably be an even bigger surprise to the faithful they represent. Instead, they seemed to accept the principle that the mind is inexorably tied to the brain, and they consequently believed in a soul that is pretty much one and the same as the neurally mediated mind, a part of the physical world that must by its nature obey the laws of physics. Hello there in the chat. I don't know if I should try to say Koyana Katsi, something like that. Hello. Theologians who link the soul to the physical world actually have history on their side. While many Christians today continue to believe in a soul that is separate from the body and that survives death, this idea didn't really become prominent in Christianity until the Middle Ages. Early Christian teachings emphasized the resurrection of the body itself on Judgment Day, rather than merely the survival of a non-material soul. If the soul is indeed physical in nature, part of the dilemma about how to sustain a belief in both physics and God would be solved, the part about how the soul meshes with the body. However, the thoroughly modern theologians would still be in a bit of a quantum pickle. If the soul is equivalent to the mind, and the mind depends on the functioning of the brain, how can God interact with people without physically affecting their neurons and thus intervening? Not surprisingly, the Vatican Conference ended inconclusively. No matter how all the pieces of the puzzle were moved around, they didn't fit together to make a coherent picture. As the philosopher David Hume said long ago, logic and reasoning, and presumably science, cannot explain the immortality of the soul. Either you believe or you don't. My reasons for discussing this conference and the issues it raised is not so much to argue the point that it would be difficult, and maybe impossible, to find scientific solutions to theological riddles, but rather to demonstrate that a spiritual view of the self isn't, or doesn't have to be, completely incompatible with a biological one. Whatever else we are and aren't, much of what we are is accounted for by what goes on in our brains. Some theologians, as we've seen, have come to accept this. But even people who believe in an immaterial soul that survives death have acknowledged the fact that the normal functioning of the soul depends on the brain. Shakespeare embraced this notion when he called the brain the soul's frail dwelling. That sounds about right. A few minutes with my mother, a devout Catholic with Alzheimer's disease, makes it painfully clear just how fragile the soul's dwelling is. The limits of logic. Theologians aren't the only ones who have concerned themselves with interactions between body and soul. The question is also one of the major puzzles that has occupied philosophers through the ages. In the 17th century, the French mathematician Rene Descartes devised a way of thinking about body and soul that has shaped philosophical debate on this topic ever since. Like the contemporary theologians described above, Descartes sought a means of reconciling science and faith. His solution was to propose that the mental and the physical were separate substances that met and interacted at a special place in the brain. Historians seem to agree that the earliest Greek philosophers did not have clearly distinguished notions of body and soul. Later, though, some philosophers came to view body and soul as separate. Plato, for example, believed that the intellectual essence of an individual, his psyche or soul, survives death. In fact, Plato looked forward to death so that he could be free of his body and all its needs and passions, and finally be capable of pure thought. For Aristotle, in contrast, body and soul were so integrally related that they could not be separated, though they could be distinguished conceptually. By the Middle Ages, philosophers adopted a combination of these notions, viewing body and soul as two unified substances, like Aristotle, but regarding the soul as eternal, like Plato. Aquinas, for example, believed that the intellectual, non-material qualities of mind gave the soul immortality, and that the body was resurrected and reunited with the soul on Judgment Day. This was the intellectual backdrop against which Descartes played his influential discussion of body and mind. Like Plato, he viewed the mental and physical as separate substances. My soul, by which I am what I am, is entirely and absolutely distinct from my body and can exist without it. In a fusion of faith and psychological theory, Descartes equated the soul with consciousness and said only humans have conscious control of their behavior. Therefore, only human souls can gain or lose access to heaven by their actions. The behaviors of other animals were, in Descartes' scheme, reflexive or automatic, and carried out without thought. So, for Descartes, if it wasn't conscious, it wasn't mental. Descartes didn't exactly deny the existence of unconscious processes, but simply relegated them to the physical world, proposing that they function in humans the way they do in mindless, soulless animals. But if the physical and the mental are completely different entities, how can the conscious soul, the mental, be responsible for the physical body? Descartes' solution was that the conscious soul substance can interact with the material body by means of a small region of the brain called the pineal gland. While most parts of the brain exist in duplicate, the pineal gland is singular and centrally located, which suggested to Descartes that it must be the seat of mind-body interaction, a place where commands from the soul can influence the body, and where information from the body, either about the outside world or the body itself, can enter the soul as perceptions, emotions, and knowledge. In Descartes' scheme, the non-physical soul substance actually served the dual function of communicating with the physical body as well as with God. This interplay between physical and non-physical substances is precisely the kind of solution to the problem of how God interacts with people that the theologians at the Vatican Conference were trying to move beyond. Our interest here, however, is not in the theological question, how does God interact with the soul, but in the philosophical one, how does the mind interact with the body? Descartes' framing of the philosophical question, and his particular answer to it, a mind-body interaction in the brain, set up the conundrum known as the mind-body problem, which philosophers have struggled with ever since. So when I look through the rest of this book, I can see that most of the volume of the book is concerned with neurobiology and the chemistry involved in neurobiology. But I like that these first couple chapters are setting the scene, describing a context for the discussion about neurobiology. Sort of setting the stage, which helps, I think, to provide a baseline for people that might not be as acquainted with the history of this topic of inquiry. And I think it will eventually also serve as a literary stage. Eventually, some of the things that are open questions in this book will be answered. It seems likely within the next couple hundred years. And once that happens, something like this that provides historical and scientific context before engaging in its discussion will be valuable for the historian. In my experience, the history of science and the philosophy of science are pretty closely related. They almost seem to move kind of at the same rate, maybe. And we'll continue in just a moment. In the back of the book, there is what is this? I guess it's the footnotes. There's not enough. There's footnotes and citations everywhere through this book. I've been pretty much ignoring them. But they occasionally there will be a footnote that will reference something in the back of the book in a bit of a appendix that will link to, not always a citation. Sometimes it's just a clarification on things. For a summary of how Descartes, this is in a footnote in the appendix, for a summary of how Descartes' views came to be so influential, see Rorty, 1979. That's very vague. I assume there was someone named Rorty who published a book in 1979, and I certainly won't be able to dig into the book too much without going on a rabbit hole, but I'm kind of curious to look it up and see what I can find about it. So when I look for Rorty, 1979, we get a entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I think I've recommended this site on a previous video, and if I haven't, I should have. There's also a Wikipedia entry, Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature. Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature is a 1979 book by American philosopher Richard Rorty, in which the author attempts to dissolve modern philosophical problems instead of solving them by presenting them as pseudo-problems that only exist in the language game of epistemological projects. That's a very appealing little snippet. I'm interested in that, but let's move on. Richard Rorty in Wikipedia, a separate entry from his book. Rorty argues that the central problems of modern epistemology depend upon a picture of the mind as trying to... Also curious, but indulge me for a second. We're going to look up epistemology. The theory of knowledge, with regards to its methods of gaining knowledge, I guess, or invalidating it, validity, and scope. Epistemology is the investigation of what distinguishes justified belief from opinion. It sounds like they're saying justified belief and knowledge are equivalent. But I'm biased in drawing that conclusion because I believe those are equivalent terms. Speaking of rabbit holes. Anyway. Princeton University Press also has an entry on this book. When it first appeared in 1979, Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature hit the philosophical world like a bombshell. Rorty argued that beginning with the 17th century, is that when Descartes lived? Philosophers developed an unhealthy obsession with the notion of representation, comparing the mind to a mirror that reflects reality. I wonder if that has any causal link to the arts of the time. 17th century was when the Renaissance it was late Renaissance, I believe. And the Renaissance was known, among other things, for visually representing reality in a way that had a lot of fidelity, meaning that art looked extra realistic, more realistic than it ever had. And a big part of the reason for that is, from what I understand, is because the rules of visual perspective were discovered. And so from the Renaissance era, you'll see all sorts of paintings just really, really celebrating the distal focus, what is that called? A perspective, just the lines of perspective, I guess. And so when I see the term representation and 17th century, of course, that seems to be, or there's an association there, but if we, it would be probably not within the realm of science to say that art influenced the philosophies, or that philosophies influenced art. Epistemological behaviorism. Let's see, knowledge-related behavior. So you behave based on your level of knowledge. I recognize I'm just skimming material here, but it's a nice snapshot of material, so it seems like a good spread of snippets. And then it seems like most of these links now are commentary about the book that came out in 1979, and probably some sorts of arguments against it, because that's what you do in the philosophical community. You critique. Returning to the book Synaptic Self. I want to make 2 points about this subject that are relevant to the present discussion. First, in equating the mind with consciousness, Descartes framed the mind-body problem in terms of the relation between consciousness and the brain. As such, the mind-body problem, in its traditional conception, concerns an aspect of the mind rather than the whole mind. Most of what the brain does is not, in fact, part of the traditional mind-body debate. Some contemporary philosophers take a broader view than Descartes and accept that certain unconscious aspects of brain function also contribute to mental life. However, they regard such non-conscious aspects as easy problems that are not really the concern of philosophy. As will become apparent later in this chapter, I believe that these implicit or unconscious aspects of the self also play an important role, in fact, an essential one, in shaping who we are and explaining why we do what we do. Second, it's important to distinguish the philosophical mind-body problem from the neuroscientific problem about how the brain creates the mind. Philosophers, by definition, seek philosophical solutions to problems, including the mind-body problem, and discuss the possible relations, the logic that might exist between fundamental substances in nature, matter, and mind. Neuroscientists, by contrast, typically start with the assumption that the materialist view of the mind-body problem is correct, that the mind is a product of the brain, and then try to understand how the brain makes the mind possible. In fact, many philosophers today accept some version of materialism, but even if the tides should shift in the coming years, and dualism, the belief that mind and body are separate substances, should take over philosophy, neuroscientists will not be out of jobs. Brain researchers are, after all, studying the brain, not philosophy. This does not mean that the paths of the neuroscientist and philosopher never cross. They often do, and when they do, each group has sometimes been enlightened and sometimes enraged by the other. That sentence has a footnote on it. So I'm going to see what the footnote refers to. Oh, there is a very big paragraph. That is that footnote. And I'm eager to dive into it. Let's see what it says. Philosophers can and have helped in the area of mind and brain by analyzing the mental in ways that can be pursued by brain researchers. Jerry Fodor's philosophical analysis of what constitutes a mental module, a self-contained mental system, has been very useful in stimulating research and discussion in neuroscience. Okay, that is just the first cited reference. There are several here, but I'm very curious. So we're going to return to Google. And we're going to look up Fodor 1983. And I'm going to include the terms mental module, modularity of mind. Again, from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Sorry, I got distracted by my notepad down here. I don't think I'm taking as many photographs this time. Mostly just audio here with an occasional online query. All right, to return. Among the principal jobs of central systems is the fixation of belief, perceptual belief included, via non-demonstrative inference. Fodor, 1986, argues that this sort of process cannot be realized in an informationally encapsulated system, and hence that central systems cannot be modular. And then there's a link to what is a mental module, which is basically what I was wanting to know. So I'm just going to click on it. And I'm curious if it matches something I've thought about before, which is like a virtual object. Okay, what is a mental module? In his classic introduction to modularity, Fodor lists 9 features that collectively characterize the type of system that interests him. Domain specificity, mandatory operation, limited central accessibility, fast processing, informational encapsulation, shallow outputs, fixed neural architecture, characteristic and specific breakdown patterns, characteristic ontogenetic pace and sequencing. Look up ontogenetic. Refers to the origination and development of an organism. So, ontogenetic. This word characteristic, this means that it's characteristic, but whatever the characters are not really not described here, which is fine. That's fine. A cognitive system counts as modular if it is modular to some interesting extent. Speaking of subjective, meaning that it has most of these features to an appreciable degree. This is a weighted most, since some marks of modularity are more important than others. Information encapsulation, for example, is more or less essential for modularity. And just for some background, we'll look up modularity as well. A property of systems. So a system is a thing that can be modular. And this is just from Science Direct. So I assume it mostly fits in here. Which measures the degree to which densely connected compartments within a system can be decoupled into separate communities or clusters, which interact more among themselves rather than other communities. Let's see if we have any visual cues here. We have 4 types of modularity. So there's axes here. We've got diverse interface, identical interface, main body, no main body. So these modules can swap components, but they exist connected to a central piece. Bus modularity. They all have the same interface and they're connected to a central body. These can have different components and no main body, and then these have the same interface, same components, but no central location. So this is all pretty abstract. I'm trying to think of an example. The first thing that occurred to me was the idea of a modular phone. And I don't know that these exist, or if they do, they're not commercially successful, but a modular phone would be one that you can swap pieces in and out of, like a desktop computer. So those of you who may have built your own computers before, you've interfaced with a modular system, and in this case, I believe it's of the top left box here, component swapping, because you've got a main body, which is the motherboard, and then the main body has various ports, different types of ports for things to plug into. So again, I can't be sure. I'm doing a very surface level sweep of some of these concepts. But the way this diagram seems to illustrate things, that would be an example of that. Sectional modularity, maybe it's a little bit silly, but I think of blockchains. I don't know if that's correct or accurate, but that's how it seems to me, but I don't have enough knowledge about it to go into details. And then I'm trying to think of other examples. Bus modularity, what would that be? I'm not sure. And we could go into it, but I feel like I was just trying to answer a simple question here, which is what is a module? And a module is any self-contained piece of functionality inside a system. So even with this very conformed bus modularity system here, where there's a main body and each module plugs in exactly the same way, each module has a barrier of some kind, a border or a limit or a constraint, some sort of defined border, I feel is important to the definition of module. And again, I may be getting a little distracted by my own, I have this experimental software project to create an API for mental modules, like mental virtual objects, and I honestly haven't gotten too far on it, but that's what's distracting me when I read about these things. Encapsulation is that concept of having a border. It's enclosed. It's got a perimeter of some kind. It doesn't have to be a physical perimeter. It can be like a conceptual perimeter, or a encoding perimeter, or inaccessibility encoding is also relative to that. Cognitive system is informationally encapsulated to the extent that in the course of processing a given set of inputs, it cannot access information stored elsewhere. There's some example for language here. Oh, and then a visual. This is a common optical illusion. Let's see what it says about it. Then, in the case of perception, the claim that perceptual systems are informationally encapsulated is equivalent to the claim that the data that can bear on the confirmation of perceptual hypotheses includes, in the general case, considerably less than the organism may know. To me, I feel like that matches the way emotional systems function. But here they go on to say, the classic illustration of this property comes from the study of visual illusions, or optical illusions, which tend to persist even after the viewer is explicitly informed about the character of the stimulus. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I like that. Informational encapsulation is related to what? Piley-Shine, that can't be how you pronounce that, calls cognitive impenetrability, but the two properties are not the same. Cognitive impenetrability is a matter of encapsulation relative to information stored in central memory. But a system could be encapsulated in this respect without being encapsulated across the board. Okay, all right. It's going to go into more details here that we've already gone too far down this path. This is no longer a casual Google search. All right. And that was just one piece of the footnote. Okay, so so what the footnote is basically saying, that ideas like that, about mental modules, for instance, provide to science I believe, a framework for conceptualizing and possibly testing. Also important to keep in mind is a distinction made by John Searle and others between the search for the neural correlates of consciousness and the search for the mechanisms of consciousness. That is, many brain events may occur during a conscious experience, but not all of these will be related to the generation of that experience. There is an interesting point that maybe clever thinking about the way the brain works, not just about how the mind works, may be a key to progress. Philosophical progress, maybe, or scientific progress. Scientific seems obvious, so I think philosophical. Okay, don't want to lose my spot here. It's getting a little dark. Turn on the light. Okay. Let's see, where else? Trying to think about how far to go into this chapter, or what maybe to skip. The next section addresses some questions. Is a person a body, a mind in a body? Does a person have to be human? Are all humans persons? Could a creature from another planet be a person? Can a human lose personhood as a result of brain damage, insanity, or moral transgressions? When, during life, does personhood start and stop? Is an embryo or an infant a person? What about someone who lingers for months in a coma from which he will, by medical prediction, never recover? Oh, these are all pretty heavy questions. I remember discussing them in I took a bioethics class in college while I was getting my degree, and that was one of the most interesting and probably impactful classes. It really informed my ideas about morality and right and wrong. But some of these are gnarly questions that don't have a good answer, or certainly not a good socially compatible answer. By that I mean, well, like, there are attitudes like nihilism, right, where nothing matters, and if that turns out to be cosmically true, fine, but it doesn't help inform social policy on matters. The same is true for some of these biological questions. And it goes on to say something like that. It says, John Locke had something, if we can't establish precisely what a person is, it matters little whether we are one or not. John Locke had something like this in mind when he said hundreds of years ago that person is a forensic term, appropriating actions and their merit, and so belongs only to intelligent agents capable of a law, and happiness and misery. This personality extends itself beyond present existence to what is past only by consciousness. There's a lot in there. Let's see. More discussion about personhood. According to Peter Strawson, because we can attribute our own states of consciousness to ourselves, others like us must also have similar states of consciousness. If we can figure out how to identify those who are like us, we can know to whom consciousness should be attributed. In other words, we can know who is a person. To do this, he distinguished between two kinds of statements, those that obviously can be applied to material bodies that also exhibit consciousness, such as is in pain, is thinking, believes in God, and those that can be applied equally to material bodies that are conscious and that are not, is heavy, is tall, is hard. Many philosophers have taken the view that personhood is a characteristic of intelligent, conscious creatures, that consciousness is, in fact, the quality that defines personhood. But others demand more in the form of a moral element, which I think means that the question of personhood is incomplete without a assertion on the moral value of that person, which actually makes a lot of sense to me. I can see that that would be a closely coupled concept. The metaphysical person is a thinking, feeling, intelligent, conscious agent, while the moral person is one who is accountable for his actions. Okay, so it's not quite the same idea, but close. The concept of the self is closely related to the philosophical notion of a person. One much discussed distinction is between the minimum and the narrative self. The former, the minimum self, is an immediate consciousness of oneself, and the latter, the narrative, a coherent self-consciousness that extends with past and future stories that we tell about ourselves. The narrative self bears some relation to the postmodern notion that the self is socially constructed. While social construction is often viewed as diametrically opposed to a scientific view of man, the two are not necessarily at odds with each other, since brains, in the end, are responsible for both the behaviors that collectively constitute the social milieu, and for the reception by each individual of the information conveyed by this milieu. Which, again, it ties back to his previous clarification, which you can find in the previous video, which is that regardless of where the self comes from, whether it is something, I guess, like essential about existence, or whether it is put together in kind of a composite way. Either way, the way the self is expressed through the brain and constructed through the brain, neurologically and chemically, is the same. So he is not going to address those questions as much, because he continues to reiterate that he is interested in the question of how the brain generates the self, or what is the brain's relationship to the mind and to the self. Let's see. He goes on to talk about consciousness, but there's non-conscious aspects, as mentioned earlier, things that determine lots of the most unconscious things, like your heartbeat and your, what frequency your brain is emitting in its brain waves, and that seems to me to be a spectrum. So those like physical realities, the internal measuring of your temperature, that sort of thing. That's on the extreme end of unconscious processing of my brain. But there's sort of a middle gray area, I believe, where behavior is moderated, I think, a little bit. And the fear system can plug into that. For example, can send us into a panic or like a physical, like fight or flight sort of panic. But then at all other times we say, oh, my behavior is a result of my conscious processing. But that just simply isn't always the case. Oh, I lost my spot. Let's see. Once we accept that the self of a human can have conscious and non-conscious aspects, it becomes easy to see how other animals can be thought of as having selves, so long as we are careful about which aspects of the self we are ascribing to each species in question. Excuse me. Sorry, I know I keep pausing, but I keep having things to say. Ascribing a self to something like a animal, to me, correlates to that concept of modularity as having a perimeter. If the self has a perimeter, whether it is like internally, consciously produced, or whether it's just by the happenstance of neural reality, chemical, physical limitations. For example, my cat maybe doesn't have, well, I would be hard-pressed to say my cat doesn't have a narrative about itself. But of course it's not as cognizant, self-aware as something like a human. Let's use the example of something like a goldfish then. A goldfish almost certainly does not have any narrative conscious processing about itself, yet it still has a perimeter. It has a perceptual perimeter. If I have a goldfish over there on the counter and I stub my toe over on my, on my computer desk, the goldfish can't perceive or immediately sense the information that I'm processing about that pain and about that impact. And so there is implicitly a perimeter there, a boundary that defines what the goldfish's self is. And maybe mine is different just by its, I sometimes think that the recursive, like there's a recursive quality to selfhood, right? Or self-awareness at least, that helps to define that perimeter. For instance, my body might not constitute the boundary of, or the perimeter of myself, because if my body changes, my self-perception doesn't necessarily change along with that. I don't say to myself, oh, I'm a different person now because I lost my finger or my foot or my ear. I don't know what kind of mischief I'm going to get into, but regardless, it's not going to turn me into a different person directly. Although I can see over time it could be argued you would develop into a different person than you would have been otherwise. And that's a good example of why all of this is so muddy. I
I sort of am overriding this chapter with my own opinions on the matter. But he talks about, what kind of consciousness do cats, dogs, birds, lizards, frogs, or fish experience? What are their minds like? And we just can't know. Again, because of that perimeter issue. All right, let's see. Questions about the person or the self, and whether those are physical or mental things. They lay out the territory in a way that is useful for analyzing broad categories of experience, but does not tell us much about how to pursue mechanisms in the brain. If we are going to figure out how it is that our brains make us who we are, we need a way of linking a fairly detailed conception of who we are to neural functions. Psychology may be more relevant to that purpose. Right, the next little segment here is a history of psychological science, which is interesting. I may not linger here long, but in the late 19th century, a German physiologist, Wilhelm Wundt, began doing experiments to understand the way the mind works, rather than just speculating about it. But early in the 20th century, some psychologists began to argue that there was no way to conduct scientific research, since one's conscious experiences can only be known personally and cannot be verified by anyone else. So then that spawned behaviorism, which was based on the premise that a scientifically valid psychology had to focus on observable events, behavioral responses, rather than internal states. Radical behaviorists denied that consciousness even existed. They claim, for example, that mental states were illusions created by tendencies to act in one way or the other. My argument against this is that an illusion requires an observer. You can't give a plant, you can't make a plant be fooled by an illusion because it doesn't have a central conception of what a thing is in order for it to be recognized as another thing and mistaken like that. There's just not enough processing going on for that. There needs some aspect of observation in order for an illusion to occur. And that thing, therefore, that observational, plane or whatever, would be what consciousness is. So, I'm doing my own philosophical critiquing here. I haven't pitted that against anyone in a live discussion, but it's difficult for me these days to find debate that I can participate in a healthy way. Toward the middle of the 20th century, it dawned on some scientists that the operations or computations performed by computers were not unlike what a human does when solving a problem. This notion was embraced by some far-sighted psychologists like Jerry Bruner and George Miller, and the cognitive approach to psychology, which emphasized internal mechanisms that process information, was born. This was an attractive alternative to mindless behaviorism, and eventually the cognitive movement dethroned behaviorism and brought the mind back to psychology. I think both of those to be most accurate, those should be studied in a balanced way, I think, and I hope that they are. The cognitive movement had a tremendous impact on psychology, but its influence did not stop there. Information processing concepts were also adopted by workers in linguistics, anthropology, and other social sciences, as well as mathematics and physics. And just as psychologists were conceiving of minds in terms of computer operations, computer scientists and mathematicians were pursuing the notion that computers might form mind-like operations, an idea that led to the field of artificial intelligence. Ultimately, cognitive science emerged as an interdisciplinary approach to understanding how the mind works. It came to be called the new science of mind. Hello there in the chat, Lugal. I appreciate your compliments. I also enjoy ones where I go to a place. I brought this up in the last video I did, where I have a microphone and I have a phone, and I'd like to combine those two into a single live stream, or at least recorded video, but I can't figure out how to combine those two things. It's a technical failing on my part, but I assume it's one that I'm going to solve if I keep thinking about it or asking about it. Let's see. Cognitive processes are not dependent on consciousness. Because of that, the mental versus physical dilemma does not have to be overcome in order to study the brain mechanisms of cognition. There's many unconscious cognitive processes. That's how we know that. But even as we study cognition and how specific cognitive processes work, cognitive approaches fall short when it comes to explaining the self. By its very definition, cognitive science is a science of only a part of the mind, the cognitive part, and not a science of the whole mind. Traditionally, the mind has been viewed as a trilogy: emotion, motivation, and cognition. The fact that emotion and motivation are not studied by cognitive science makes sense if cognitive science is regarded as a science of cognition, but is troubling if the field is supposed to be the science of mind. A mind without feelings and strivings might be able to solve certain problems given it by a cognitive psychologist, but it doesn't stack up well as the mental foundation of a self. A second shortcoming of cognitive science is that it has not grappled successfully with how various cognitive processes interact to form the mind. Considerable progress has been made in understanding how perception, memory, and thinking work, but not about how they work together. Our hopes, fears, and desires influence how we think, perceive, and remember. A science of mind needs to account for and understand these complex processes. But it would be hard to overstate the importance of cognitive science. So when I single out the shortcomings of the field, I do so not to condemn it, but instead to simply point out that it's incomplete when it comes to understanding what makes us who we are. Hello there, Zappa. Welcome to the chat. The personality contest. Let's see. Psychology is an imperfect marriage between the experimental approach and the other approach is more concerned with how well-adjusted people are and how they might change their behavior to approach their psychological well-being. Okay, so, right, there's a scientific element and a social element. I think I would say. answer your question, Lugal, seems like a weird distinction to me. Is motivation not cognitive? Let me see if I skipped anything here. So the first word he used for motivation, motivation was in parentheses. The other word he used was conation. So I think I'm going to try to Google that and see if anything comes up that explains the separation between motivation and cognition. Conation. The mental faculty of purpose, desire, or will. Okay, so I think, so that, let me know if this makes sense to you, that will, when you think of willpower, that kind of will, could be considered separate from cognition because cognition could be seen as the act of information processing. So you process a whole bunch of information and categorize it and organize it. That's the cognition process. And from that process arises will or motivation or some impulse to act. And perhaps, I think this model, again, let's see, what does it say? It says, this is a traditional model of viewing the mind in terms of three: the cognition, emotion, and motivation. So, not necessarily materially unlinked, but traditionally they're thought of this way. I think it's an interesting question because, and a lot of it depends on definitions, but if cognition is comparable to how like computer processing, like if you think of your cognition as like your CPU, the CPU performs calculations on different items, different input and instructions, but it doesn't predetermine what the results of those calculations are going to be. I think it can kind of be thought of in that way. Let's see. Oh, we were just approaching the difference between like psychological science and psychological therapy, I guess. Let's see. It kind of talks about psychotherapy a little bit. Mentions Freud and Carl Jung. Jung, for example, broke away from strict Freudianism, and I think these days Jung's work is considered to be a little more relevant. Psychoanalytic theory today is probably best viewed as a family of theories rather than a single well-defined view of how the mind works and how it breaks down in psychopathology. But again, psychoanalysis focuses a lot on the nature of a well-adjusted person. From like that inherently means, adapted to its social environment, which is obviously related to psychology, but not definitive of it. Okay, a view of the self. So far, I've used the terms personality and the self rather loosely. Now it's time to get more specific. From here on, when I use the term the self, I am referring to the totality of the living organism. This notion subsumes the idea of personality and is similar to what William James had in mind when he described the self as the sum total of who one is. This notion subsumes the idea of personality as a footnote. Let's see if it says anything interesting. Personality is usually a broader term, since self usually means conscious self. But in my scheme, self is the broader term, since only people are persons, but all organisms have selves. Yes, that seems related to what I was saying earlier. Let's see. Carl Rogers summed up a view defining the self as the organized, consistent conceptual gestalt composed of perceptions of the characteristics of the I, or me. These perceptions are available to awareness, though not necessarily in awareness. In spite of this long tradition of emphasis on the self as a conscious entity, the self that we are aware of, or can be aware of, is not the entirety of what the term the self refers to. The psychologist Ruth Monroe, for example, argues for a more fundamental view. She points out that a sense of self which develops in the course of living is too far confused with the truly necessary organismic self. Monroe is questioning whether the sense of self that develops over time is the whole self. Side note, calling it, I think, the sense of self is, I don't know if he's going to go into this, but there really is a sensation associated with selfhood. If you ask those who have ever experienced dissociative periods, they can tell you that the sensation, the mental perceptual sensation involved with identification with the self is something that can be interrupted or changed, or it can shift to an identification with another thing. And I think that's important to think about too, because our sensation of self has to be part of the approach to this sort of analysis. This does get investigated, but like with the concept of philosophical zombies, for instance, are people or even humans who behave the same way as all other humans or persons, but have no self-awareness, have no consciousness or sense of self. And there is a thought experiment or question as to whether that type of person is still a person. And so basically, if you're going to examine this topic and ask these questions, defining personhood is a crucial element of it, but also you've got to look at things like, okay, if I have a sense of self and that sensation is generated by a specific component of the brain, if you remove that element of the brain, like physically, for example, so that the person no longer has that sensation of self, are they still a self? Do they still have one? So how related is it to the sensation of selfhood? And if it's not related, then you have to examine again the relationship of a organism to its own selfhood, and maybe it's, well, that goes down a rabbit hole too, because that leads into the discussion about the definition of any given object. Like, that's the ship of Theseus quandary, where you've got a ship and you replace it piece by piece, like a board here and a board there, until the entire ship is made of different materials. Is it the same ship? And that is obviously relevant to humans because the way our cells operate. Our cells replace themselves every so often, and some cells do it much more frequently than others, but like the common wisdom is like every 7 or 9 years or something, every cell in your body has been replaced with another cell. And is that relevant, or is it just that we have the same genetic code? But then the genetic code isn't sufficient to explain how the organism actually expresses. So this is obviously a very dense and windy, and it's gnarly. It's a gnarly topic. Things we consciously know about who we are make up the explicit aspects of the self. These are what we refer to by the term self-aware and constitute what we call our self-concept. They are what the self-psychologists are interested in. The implicit aspects of the self are all other aspects of who we are that are not immediately available to consciousness, either because they are by their nature inaccessible, or because they are accessible but not being accessed at the moment. The self is a unit. The self is not static. Not all aspects of the self are learned. Some aspects of the self are learned. The most well-articulated view of the role of genes in shaping behavioral and mental characteristics comes from biological trait theories of personality, which propose that one's enduring qualities are due to one's genetic background. Considerable evidence has been amassed to support the view that some traits are highly influenced by one's genetic history. Nevertheless, there are two important caveats to genetic theory of personality. First, genes have been found to account for only about 50% of a particular personality trait. What this statement means is that genes account at most for half of a given trait, not that half of all personality is accounted for by genes. For some traits, genetic influence is far less and is often not measurable. Introversion is probably the trait with the strongest genetic influence. Let's see. But when extreme introversion is caught early, it can be reversed to some extent by a supportive family environment. This suggests that genes do not fully dictate psychological destiny. The second caveat shows that people are not always true to their so-called personality traits. One may be shy at work or in social groups, but domineering at home. In fact, when psychologists have examined the consistency of behavior across situations, the results have not supported the view that people act consistently in different situations. Observations such as these suggest that behavioral and mental states are not dictated by constitutional factors, but instead are situationally determined. Walter Mischel argues that the ability to predict behavior depends upon knowing about a person's thoughts, motivations, and emotions relative to a particular set of circumstances. He describes these as if-then relations. If you are in situation A, then you do X, but if in situation B, then you do Y. According to Michel, people don't possess stable personality traits over time, but stable if-then profiles. I like that. Mark Epstein, who has tried to integrate psychoanalysis and Buddhism, points out that the ego's image of itself, its object image, is always lacking as an account of the subject, the self, implying that much of the self is, in essence, implicit. While the whole self is not usually encountered by the individual who possesses it, who is it, or by others, it nevertheless exists. What then is it? In my view, the self is the totality of what an organism is, physically, biologically, psychologically, socially, and culturally. Though it is a unit, it is not unitary. It includes things that we know and things that we do not know, things that others know about us that we do not realize. It includes features that we express and hide, and some that we simply don't call upon. It includes what it would like to be, as well as what we hope we never become. The fact that all aspects of the self are not usually manifest simultaneously, and that different aspects can even be contradictory, may seem to present a hopelessly complex problem. However, this simply means that different components of the self reflect the operation of different brain systems, which can be but are not always in sync. While explicit memory is mediated by a single system, there are a variety of different brain systems that store information implicitly, allowing for many aspects of the self to coexist. Meaning that your direct memory, what you can recall consciously, is only one version of information storage in your brain, and different systems store information in different ways, different formats, and which means it's recalled differently as well. As William James said, neither threats nor pleadings can move a man unless they touch some one of his potential or actual selves. In Orlando, Virginia Woolf pointed out, a biography is considered complete if it merely accounts for 6 or 7 selves, whereas a person may well have as many thousand. Or, as the painter Paul Klee expressed it, the self is a dramatic ensemble. Theories of the self and personality are not usually framed in ways that are compatible with our understanding of brain function. How, then, can we relate the complex constellation I've called the self to the systems and synapses of the brain? The goal of the rest of the book is to answer this question. In order to understand the self, we need to explain how brain systems underlying thinking, emotion, and motivation, the mental trilogy, develop under the influence of nature and nurture, and how these systems make it possible for us to attend to, perceive, learn about, and store and retrieve experiences. And it seems like in a lot of ways we're going to examine how the brain processes mimetic information and how that operates to construct beliefs, and that should be interesting. The point is not simply to state that learned and innate interactions between cognitive, emotional, and motivational processes make us who we are, but instead to explain how those interactions work. So that's essentially the end of this chapter called Seeking the Self. In the next chapter, there will be more diagrams. So if I end up reading that one, I will be able to display more pictures. Eventually, I'll find a more elegant way to display things than this sort of ill-cropped desktop window, but it works. That's the whole point for now. It functions. I need 2 bookmarks here because I had one to keep my spot in the book, and now I need one to keep my spot in the appendix, because it turns out that all these footnotes can actually be very interesting at times. So let's see, maybe I can use I've got several notebooks here. I'm sure one of them can help me create a bookmark. Was a sketchbook that I bought recently. I went on Etsy and I bought a whole bunch of different sketchbooks to see which ones I liked the most. Turns out there's some good stuff. But this one, the fate of this particular page is not to be in a sketchbook, but it's to be a bookmark. My cat has joined me on my lap and wants to participate in this. Seems like, hello there. You can't see it, but it is a passable looking bookmark, so I will use that to save my place, and we'll see if I get the opportunity to continue it later on. For those of you who are still with me, I very much appreciate you sticking around, saying hi, or just lurking. I hope everyone out there is staying safe and taking it easy. Please take good care of yourselves. Thanks again. I'll see you later.